January 25, 2025, Indianapolis, Indiana. The temperature outside hovered just above freezing as patrol cars pulled into the parking lot of Timber Point Apartments. Neighbors peered through their blinds, watching officers respond to what initially seemed like a routine call, a mother reporting her 2-year-old daughter missing. Officer James Mendez would later tell reporters that nothing in his 15 years of service could have prepared him for what awaited inside apartment 4B. When we entered, the cold hit us first, Mendez recalled. Inside that apartment, the temperature gauge read between 46 and 51 degrees. No heat in the middle of winter, but it was the smell that stopped us in our tracks. What those officers discovered wasn't a missing child case at all. It was something far worse. The body of 2-year-old Skylar Gardner lay motionless beneath a fallen dresser, her tiny frame already cold to the touch. Her hands and feet showed signs of frostbite. Multiple bruises marked her small body. A puncture wound near her neck told its own horrific story. But perhaps most disturbing was the state of the apartment itself. A prison of filth where young Skylar and her 3-year-old brother had been left to fend for themselves. Garbage piled in corners, human waste smeared on walls and floors, empty food containers scattered throughout. This wasn't the aftermath of a sudden tragedy. This was systematic neglect that had been ongoing for months. Yet the woman who led officers to this scene of horror, 33-year-old Skylar Gardner, was known to many in the Indianapolis music community. By night, she performed at local venues, guitar in hand, voice captivating audiences who knew nothing of what took place behind closed doors. Social media accounts showcased a talented musician with a growing following. Photos captured her smiling on stage, seemingly without a care in the world. But where was Skylar during the long winter nights when her children shivered alone in that freezing apartment? According to investigators, she was warming herself in the bed of her 39-year-old boyfriend, Brian Thomas. This isn't just a story about neglect. It's about choices. About a mother who repeatedly chose her romantic relationship over the basic needs of her defenseless children. It's about how, for months, Skylar and her brother existed in a parallel universe to their mother's public life, one filled with darkness, cold, and profound abandonment. How does a mother walk away from her babies? Asked Detective Sarah Williams during a press conference following Gardner's arrest. How does anyone leave a toddler alone for days, knowing there's no food, no heat, no supervision? Those questions would haunt investigators as they pieced together the timeline of events that led to Skylar's death. What began as brief absences in October 2024, a quick trip to the store, an hour at Thomas's apartment, gradually extended into overnight stays. Eventually, according to witness statements, Skylar would disappear for days at a time, leaving her 2-year-old daughter and 3-year-old son completely alone. The children had no way to call for help, prosecutor Michael Reynolds stated. They couldn't reach door handles to escape. They couldn't feed themselves properly or stay warm. They were trapped in conditions no human being should endure, let alone a toddler. When officers interviewed Skylar after discovering Skylar's body, her story changed repeatedly. First, she claimed she'd been home all day and found Skylar unresponsive while preparing dinner. Then she admitted leaving the children alone, just for a couple of hours, to visit Thomas. Finally, after hours of questioning, the truth emerged: she hadn't been home for 3 days. If you've ever wondered how someone could abandon their own child, this story will shake you to your core. Hit subscribe and join our community as we explore the darkest corners of human behavior. What state or country are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Tonight, we examine how a seemingly normal mother transformed into someone capable of leaving her children in conditions that would ultimately claim her daughter's life. The case of Skylar Gardner isn't just disturbing, it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and our responsibility to protect the most vulnerable among us. Skylar Marie Gardner, 33, was born in Gary, Indiana, to a single mother who struggled with addiction. Court records reveal a childhood marked by instability. She attended 7 different schools before dropping out at 16. By 20, she had accumulated a record of minor offenses: shoplifting, possession, and disorderly conduct. At 25, she gave birth to her son, followed by Skylar 2 years later. Both children had different fathers, neither of whom remained in the picture. Those who knew Gardner described her as someone who could never quite get ahead. She moved to Indianapolis in 2022, hoping for a fresh start. For a while, it seemed she might succeed. She secured an apartment at Timber Point, found work as a bartender, and appeared to be creating stability for her children. But beneath the surface, Gardner battled demons from her past, unresolved trauma that would eventually consume not only her life, but the life of her youngest child. Music became Gardner's escape from her troubled reality. She performed at small venues across Indianapolis under the stage name Channy B, developing a modest following in the local underground scene. Her raw, emotionally charged performances resonated with audiences who connected with lyrics about struggle and resilience. She had this haunting quality to her voice, recalled Marcus Wilson, owner of The Basement, a popular music venue where Gardner performed regularly. When she sang, people listened. There was authentic pain there. You couldn't fake that kind of emotion. Gardner's social media accounts painted the picture of an aspiring artist on the verge of breakthrough. She posted videos of performances, studio sessions, and promotional content for upcoming shows. These carefully curated glimpses into her musical life stood in stark contrast to her home environment. While she projected the image of a dedicated artist pursuing her passion, her apartment deteriorated into squalor, and her children suffered increasing neglect. The disparity between her public persona and private reality would later shock those who thought they knew her. Before Brian Thomas entered her life, Gardner maintained what neighbors described as a functional relationship with her children. She wasn't winning Mother of the Year awards, but she met their basic needs. Daycare workers reported that both children arrived clean, adequately dressed, and with packed lunches most days. "She seemed to be trying," said Letitia Johnson, who lived in the apartment next door. "I'd see her taking them to the playground on weekends. The little girl Skylar was always holding her hand and smiling." Gardner's social media occasionally featured photos of her children, birthday celebrations, trips to the park, ordinary moments of family life. These glimpses suggested a mother who, despite her struggles, found joy in her children. What changed this dynamic would prove devastating for everyone involved, especially for little Skylar. Gardner met Brian Thomas, 39, at one of her performances in August 2024. Their relationship intensified rapidly, consuming her attention and time. Within weeks, Thomas became a fixture in her life, though notably absent from her apartment. "She started leaving the kids with anyone who would take them," Johnson recalled. "She'd knock on my door at 10 p.m. asking if I could watch them just for an hour. She'd come back the next morning." As fall progressed, Gardner's appearances at her children's daycare became erratic. Staff noted increasing absences, late pickups, and concerning changes in the children's appearance. The apartment began to deteriorate as Gardner spent more nights at Thomas's residence across town. By November, neighbors reported hearing the children crying through the night, sometimes for hours. Gardner's performances became less frequent, yet she was rarely home, a troubling paradox that signaled her priorities had shifted dramatically. "I should have called someone," lamented Darnell Washington, the building's maintenance supervisor. "I went in to fix her leaking sink in December and couldn't believe what I was seeing. Garbage everywhere, dirty diapers piled up, barely any food in the fridge. The little boy was trying to feed his sister cereal straight from the box. I told her she needed to clean up or face eviction, but I never followed through. I keep thinking about that now." Co-workers at the Rusty Nail, where Gardner tended bar part-time, noticed changes too. "She started missing shifts, showing up disheveled," said manager Kimberly Reeves. "When I asked about her kids, she'd get defensive, say they were fine, and change the subject. The last time I saw her, about 2 weeks before everything happened, she was borrowing money from everyone. She seemed desperate, not like herself at all." A former friend who requested anonymity provided the most damning account. "I stopped by unannounced in early January. The kids were alone. The apartment was freezing. Skylar had what looked like bite marks on her arms. When I confronted Chantel later, she blocked my number. I wish I'd called the police right then." What began as brief absences, "I'll be back in an hour," stretched into elastic time frames with no definite end. Neighbors recalled seeing Gardner leave on Friday evenings, keys jangling in hand, promising the children she'd return soon. Soon became Saturday afternoon, then Sunday evening, sometimes extending into Monday. The children learned to measure time not by clocks, but by hunger pangs and dwindling food supplies. By spring, Gardner's disappearances had evolved into a predictable pattern of abandonment. She would receive a text, her face illuminating with anticipation, and within minutes she would be gone. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. The apartment door would close behind her with a decisive click, leaving the children to wonder when they might see her again. The apartment's deterioration mirrored Gardner's increasing neglect. Once white walls yellowed with grime and crayon marks that no one bothered to clean. The kitchen sink overflowed with crusty dishes, attracting small insects that eventually became permanent residents. Food remnants hardened on countertops and tables, creating a sticky film that covered every surface. The refrigerator contained a rotating collection of half-empty condiment bottles, expired milk, and occasionally a few eggs. Never enough to properly feed 2 growing children. Garbage bags piled by the door when Gardner wasn't present to take them out, their contents spilling onto the hallway carpet, emitting odors that neighbors would later describe as concerning but not quite alarming enough to prompt intervention. Gardner's social media transformed into a carefully curated showcase of her relationship, photos of romantic dinners and weekend getaways, conspicuously absent of any mention of her children. Friends later reported that Gardner spoke of Thomas with reverence, describing him as the love I've been waiting for and someone who finally puts me first. When questioned about her children during these outings, Gardner would offer vague assurances they're fine or they're old enough to manage. She began referring to Skylar as my little adult, a phrase that would later haunt investigators as they pieced together the extent of responsibilities placed on the child's small shoulders. Child psychologists consulted during the investigation explained how neglect typically follows a gradual trajectory. The parent begins with small absences, testing boundaries, noted Dr. Eleanor Simmons in her case assessment. When no immediate consequences occur, these absences extend, creating a pattern of abandonment that becomes normalized. For Gardner, each successful departure reinforced the belief that her children could survive without her. Each time she returned to find them alive, hungry and disheveled but alive, it validated her choices. The children's ability to endure became perversely permission to leave them again. School officials noted Skylar's increasing absences and declining academic performance, but attributed these changes to typical family stress. Neighbors heard occasional crying but hesitated to interfere in what they considered private family matters. The building manager noticed rent payments becoming increasingly late, but never inspected the deteriorating conditions inside. Each potential intervention point became instead another missed opportunity, another link in the chain of collective inaction that would eventually lead to tragedy. January 25, 2025 began as an unremarkable Saturday, cold and overcast with snow flurries dusting the city. At 2:17 p.m., the emergency dispatch center received a call from Skylar Gardner, her voice pitched high with what dispatchers would later describe as performative panic. "My daughter is missing," Gardner reported, her words tumbling over each other. "I can't find Skylar anywhere. I've looked everywhere." When asked when she had last seen her daughter, Gardner hesitated before answering. "This morning? Maybe around 9? The dispatcher noted the uncertainty in her voice. What Gardner failed to mention was that she had actually been away from the apartment for nearly 3 days, returning only when Thomas had ended their latest encounter. She had spent those days in a motel across town, her phone deliberately switched off. a detail phone records would later confirm. Officers Ramirez and Chen were dispatched to the address, arriving at 2:43 p.m. Gardner met them outside the apartment building, still wearing her coat, as if reluctant to invite them inside. "She might have gone to a friend's house," Gardner suggested, unable to provide names of any friends Skylar might have visited. "But she knows she's supposed to leave a note." When officers finally entered apartment 4B, they were immediately struck by two things: the biting cold and the overwhelming stench. Officer Ramirez would later testify that the temperature inside felt as cold as outdoors, noting that his breath formed visible clouds as he spoke. The heating had been shut off for non-payment weeks earlier, leaving the apartment exposed to January temperatures that had dipped below freezing for several consecutive nights. The smell, a noxious combination of rotting food, human waste, and something deeper and more concerning, caused Officer Chin to momentarily step back into the hallway. "In 15 years on the force," she would later state, "I've never encountered living conditions this severe in a home with children." The officers' body cameras captured the scene in unforgiving detail. Piles of garbage reaching waist height in corners, dishes crusted with mold, dark stains spreading across the carpet, windows sealed with plastic sheets that did little to keep out the cold. "Where's your sister?" Officer Ramirez asked Chantel Gardner's son. "Skylar's sleeping," he answered, pointing toward a closed door at the end of the hallway. The children's bedroom revealed conditions even more appalling than the main living area. Human feces were smeared across one wall, where the youngest child had apparently given up trying to reach the bathroom. Dirty clothes formed mountains in each corner. A single mattress lay on the floor, its covering long since soiled beyond recognition. And there, partially obscured by a fallen dresser, lay Skylar. Officer Chen's body camera captured the moment of discovery, her sharp intake of breath followed by the urgent radio call. "We need medical, now. Child down, unresponsive." But even as paramedics were dispatched, both officers recognized what they were seeing. Skylar Gardner, 2 years old, had been dead for hours, possibly days.
Those new court documents say 2-year-old Skylar Gardner may have been dead for several hours before she was found, and her body was full of bruises and injuries.
Tragic to think about the victim here.
A young victim who family says has such a bright smile and personality.
And unfortunately, that flame was put out too soon.
Saturday night, police say Skylar's mother called them after she found Skylar unresponsive under a dresser. Court documents say once officers got inside the apartment, they found trash, human feces, steak knives, and soiled items scattered around. When Skylar was taken to the hospital, doctors found a large puncture wound to her neck.
This life deserved to have fulfilled who knows how old, and lived a wonderful life, brought brightness into everyone's lives.
Documents reveal when Skylar's mother and her boyfriend talked with police, they both said she would spend the night at her place every night, leaving Skylar and her older brother alone in the apartment. The mother also said she would only check on the two once a day, only to bring them food and a drink, and they would be dirty. The mother denied abusing the children, but said she knew she was neglecting them.
We're the only ones in this society, adults, that can be the advocate for these children, to have a voice.
IMPD says in cases like this, it's important for other family members to be aware of any abuse or neglect and report it immediately.
Please reach out to 911, contact the police. We will get you resources. It's not criminal to ask for help, and we want you to do so.
So another child doesn't lose their life to neglect. In Indianapolis, Anna Chalker, 13 News.
Her small body was cold to the touch, her lips and fingertips tinged blue. Rigor mortis had already set in. The medical examiner would later determine her body temperature at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, far below what any living person could sustain. Frostbite had marked her extremities, turning her fingers and toes a mottled purple-black. The fallen dresser told part of the story. Investigators determined that Skylar had likely been attempting to reach something on top of the 6-drawer chest, perhaps food or warm clothing. The dresser, unstable on the uneven floor and missing its safety anchors, had toppled forward, pinning her underneath its weight. But the dresser alone didn't explain everything. The autopsy would reveal multiple injuries in various stages of healing, bruises on her arms and torso, a partially healed fracture in her left wrist, signs of chronic malnutrition with a body weight 30% below normal for her age. Her stomach was empty, suggesting she hadn't eaten for at least 24 hours before death. Most damning was the evidence that Skylar had been alive for some time after the dresser fell. Scratch marks on the floor indicated she had tried to pull herself free. The position of her body suggested she had managed to partially extract herself before succumbing to a combination of injuries, hypothermia, and exhaustion. The medical examiner estimated that Skylar had been trapped for 8 to 12 hours before death. The cause of death, the medical examiner would later testify, was multiple system failure due to hypothermia, compounded by blunt force trauma and chronic malnutrition. In layman's terms, she froze to death, weakened by injury and hunger, with no one coming to her aid. As officers led Gardner away in handcuffs, neighbors gathered in the hallway, their expressions a mixture of shock and guilt. "We heard crying sometimes," one woman admitted, "but we never thought—" Her voice trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air like an indictment. This story's difficult to hear, but it's important we don't turn away from these realities. If you're finding value in this investigation, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others. Have you ever witnessed concerning behavior toward children in your community? What did you do? From the moment police arrived at the Timber Point apartments, Chantel Gardner's statements raised red flags. Initially, she claimed that Skylar had gone missing while she was preparing dinner. She described searching the apartment frantically before calling 911. However, inconsistencies in her story quickly emerged. During her first interview at the station, Gardner admitted she had left the children alone earlier that day to visit Brian Thomas. She claimed she had only been gone for a few hours and returned to find Skylar unresponsive. When pressed further, her timeline began to shift. In a later interview, she confessed to leaving the children alone overnight, stating she had been overwhelmed and needed a break. Investigators noted that her demeanor alternated between defensive and detached, with little visible emotion when discussing her daughter's death. As the interviews continued, Gardner's story unraveled further. She eventually admitted that she had been leaving her children alone regularly since October 2024, sometimes for days at a time. Her explanations ranged from blaming financial stress to claiming she believed her children were old enough to manage on their own. These shifting narratives only deepened investigators' suspicions and painted a grim picture of prolonged neglect. Investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the timeline of events leading up to Skylar's death. Witness statements from neighbors, daycare staff, and acquaintances painted a clear picture of escalating neglect. Records showed that Gardner had stopped bringing her children to daycare in late October 2024, around the same time she began spending more time with Brian Thomas. Phone records and interviews revealed that Gardner often left her children alone for extended periods, sometimes staying at Thomas's residence for multiple nights. Surveillance footage from the apartment complex confirmed that Gardner had not returned home for at least 24 hours before Skylar's body was discovered. Through interviews with Thomas, investigators learned that Gardner had confided in him about her struggles with parenting. However, Thomas denied ever visiting the apartment or witnessing the conditions firsthand. His claims were met with skepticism, as text messages between the two revealed that he was aware of Gardner's absences and the children being left alone. This evidence solidified the timeline of neglect, showing a pattern of abandonment that spanned months. The conditions inside the apartment provided investigators with a grim backdrop to Skylar's death. Crime scene photos documented piles of garbage, rotting food, and human waste scattered across the floors. The apartment's heating system was broken, leaving the interior dangerously cold during the harsh January weather. Investigators noted that the children's clothing and bedding were insufficient to protect them from the freezing temperatures. The fallen dresser, under which Skylar's body was found, became a focal point of the investigation. Forensic analysis revealed that the dresser had been unstable for months, with missing screws and a broken base. Skylar's injuries, including bruises, bite marks, frostbite, and a puncture wound near her neck, suggested prolonged suffering. The autopsy confirmed that Skylar had died from a combination of blunt force trauma and hypothermia, with the dresser's collapse being the final fatal event. Investigators also found minimal food in the apartment, with most of it spoiled or inaccessible to the children. The refrigerator contained only a carton of expired milk and a few moldy leftovers. These findings corroborated witness accounts of neglect and painted a harrowing picture of the children's living conditions in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Experts in child welfare were brought in to provide insight into the devastating effects of such living conditions on young children. Dr. Emily Carter, a pediatrician specializing in child neglect cases, explained that prolonged exposure to extreme cold, malnutrition, and unsanitary environments can have catastrophic consequences on a child's physical and emotional development. Children as young as Skylar are incredibly vulnerable, Dr. Carter stated. Living in an environment without adequate food, warmth, or hygiene weakens their immune systems, making them more susceptible to illness and infection. The frostbite on Skylar's hands and feet indicates prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures, which would have caused immense pain and suffering. Dr. Carter also highlighted the psychological toll of neglect. At 2 years old, children rely entirely on their caregivers for safety and comfort. Being left alone for extended periods would have caused severe emotional distress, fear, and confusion. The bite marks on Skylar's body may even suggest self-soothing behaviors or attempts by her older brother to comfort her in the absence of adult care. This expert testimony underscored the severity of the neglect and the unimaginable suffering Skylar endured in her final days. Following the discovery of Skylar's body and the evidence collected, both Skylar Gardner and Brian Thomas were arrested. Gardner faced multiple charges including murder, neglect of a dependent resulting in serious bodily injury, and child endangerment. Prosecutors argued that her repeated absences and failure to provide basic necessities directly led to Skylar's death. Brian Thomas, while not present at the apartment, was charged with assisting a criminal and obstruction of justice. Investigators found text messages in which Thomas encouraged Gardner to lie to the police about her whereabouts and downplay the conditions of the apartment. Prosecutors alleged that Thomas's actions enabled Gardner's neglect by providing her with an escape from her responsibilities. The legal proceedings began shortly after their arrests. During Gardner's initial court appearance, prosecutors emphasized the egregious nature of her neglect, describing it as a pattern of abandonment that culminated in Skylar's death. Gardner's defense attorney argued that she was overwhelmed by financial and emotional stress, attempting to shift some of the blame onto systemic failures in child welfare services. However, the prosecution countered that Gardner had ample opportunities to seek help, but instead chose to prioritize her relationship with Thomas. Brian Thomas's defense team maintained that he had no direct involvement in the children's care and was unaware of the full extent of the neglect. However, prosecutors presented text messages and phone records as evidence of his complicity, arguing that his actions, or lack thereof, contributed to the tragedy. Both Gardner and Thomas were denied bail and their cases were set for trial. The Marion County Prosecutor's Office vowed to seek the maximum penalties, stating, "This case represents one of the most heartbreaking examples of neglect we've seen. We are committed to ensuring justice for Skylar and her surviving sibling." The legal process would stretch on for months, with the community closely following every development. For many, the case became a rallying cry for greater accountability in child welfare and a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of neglect. The news of Skylar Gardner's death sent shockwaves through the Indianapolis community. Residents of the Timber Point apartments, many of whom had seen the children playing outside or heard their cries through the thin walls, were devastated. For some, the tragedy brought feelings of guilt and regret for not intervening sooner. "I can't stop thinking about it," said Letitia Johnson, a neighbor who had occasionally babysat the children. "I should have done more. I heard them crying some nights, but I thought it wasn't my place to get involved. Now I wish I had called someone." The broader Indianapolis community was equally horrified. Social media platforms were flooded with posts expressing outrage and sorrow. Many questioned how such severe neglect could go unnoticed for so long, while others called for stricter oversight of child welfare cases. The story quickly gained traction in local news, with headlines describing the appalling conditions of the apartment and the heartbreaking details of Skylar's final moments. Local residents organized vigils and online discussions, determined to ensure that Skylar's death would not be forgotten. The tragedy became a rallying point for conversations about child neglect and the responsibility of communities to protect vulnerable children. Community leaders and child welfare advocates spoke out, urging action to prevent similar tragedies. Reverend Michael Harris, a prominent figure in the Indianapolis faith community, addressed the issue during a Sunday sermon. "Skylar's death is a failure on all of our parts," he said. "We must do better as neighbors, as friends, and as a society to protect our children. If you see something, say something. Don't wait." Child welfare organizations also weighed in, emphasizing the importance of reporting suspected neglect. "This case is a stark reminder of how quickly neglect can escalate into tragedy," said Angela Martinez, director of the Indiana Child Advocacy Network. "We need to empower communities to recognize the signs of neglect and provide resources for struggling families before it's too late." Local officials, including the mayor of Indianapolis, pledged to review existing child welfare policies. "We cannot allow another child to fall through the cracks," the mayor stated during a press conference. Skylar's story is heartbreaking, but it must serve as a wake-up call for all of us. In the weeks following Skylar's death, the community came together to honor her memory. A candlelight vigil was held outside the Timber Point apartments, where dozens of residents gathered to mourn the loss of a life cut tragically short. Attendees left flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes at a makeshift memorial near the apartment building's entrance. One note read, "Rest in peace, sweet Skylar. You deserved so much more." Local organizations also launched initiatives aimed at raising awareness about child neglect. A nonprofit group organized a fundraiser to support Skylar's surviving sibling, who had been placed in foster care. The funds were used to provide clothing, toys, and therapy for the young boy, as well as to support other children in similar situations. Schools in the area began hosting workshops for parents and teachers on recognizing signs of neglect and abuse. These efforts were part of a broader push to ensure that Skylar's death would not be in vain. For many in the community, the tragedy sparked a mix of grief and anger. Parents questioned how a mother could abandon her children in such conditions, while others pointed to systemic failures that allowed the neglect to continue unchecked. Online forums and local news comment sections were filled with debates about accountability, with some blaming Gardner entirely and others criticizing the lack of intervention from child welfare services. Therapists and grief counselors in the area reported an increase in families seeking support, particularly those who had been directly affected by the case. "This tragedy has left a deep scar on our community," said Dr. Rachel Michenkin, a licensed counselor who worked with several families in the area. "People are grappling with feelings of helplessness and guilt, but they're also channeling that energy into action." Skylar's story became a symbol of the need for vigilance and compassion. While the community mourned her loss, they also resolved to create a safer environment for all children. The tragedy served as a painful reminder that protecting the most vulnerable members of society requires collective effort and unwavering commitment. Child neglect is one of the most common yet underreported forms of child abuse. It often goes unnoticed until it escalates into a tragedy, as seen in Skylar Gardner's case. Recognizing the signs of neglect early can save lives and prevent long-term harm to vulnerable children. Neglect can manifest in various ways, but some of the most common warning signs include poor hygiene. Children who are consistently dirty, have unwashed clothing, or emit strong odors may be living in unsanitary conditions. This is often one of the first visible indicators of neglect. Frequent absences. A child who is frequently absent from school or daycare without explanation may be left unsupervised or in unsafe environments. Behavioral changes. Sudden shifts in behavior, such as withdrawal, aggression, or extreme clinginess, can signal distress. Neglected children may also exhibit developmental delays or struggle with social interactions. Physical signs. Unexplained injuries, signs of malnutrition such as extreme thinness or bloated stomachs, or frostbite in colder climates are red flags that should never be ignored. These signs, while not definitive proof of neglect, should prompt further observation and, if necessary, intervention. It's better to report suspicions and be wrong than to remain silent and risk a child's safety. If you suspect a child is being neglected, there are several steps you can take to help. 1. Observe and document. Pay attention to patterns of behavior or physical signs that suggest neglect. Keep a record of what you've noticed, including dates and specific incidents, as this information can be helpful to authorities. 2. Communicate your concerns. If you have a relationship with the child's caregiver, approach them with compassion. Sometimes parents may be overwhelmed and unaware of the impact their actions are having on their children. Offering support or resources can make a difference. 3. Report to authorities. If the situation appears severe or you believe the child is in immediate danger, contact your local child protective services or law enforcement. Most states allow anonymous reporting, so you don't have to fear retaliation. 4. Engage with community resources. Encourage your community to host workshops or events that educate residents about child welfare and the importance of reporting neglect. Awareness is a powerful tool in preventing abuse. It's important to remember that reporting suspected neglect is not about punishing parents. It's about protecting children and connecting families with the help they need. The statistics surrounding child neglect are sobering. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, neglect accounts for approximately 60% of all child abuse cases. In 2022 alone, over 600,000 children were confirmed victims of neglect in the United States. Tragically, neglect is also the leading cause of child fatalities in abuse cases, with infants and toddlers being the most vulnerable. The long-term impacts of neglect can be devastating. Children who experience neglect are at higher risk for physical health issues. Chronic malnutrition, developmental delays, and weakened immune systems are common among neglected children. Mental health challenges. Neglected children often struggle with anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, later in life. Educational struggles. Neglect can lead to poor academic performance, learning disabilities, and difficulty maintaining focus in school. Relationship difficulties. The lack of a stable, nurturing environment can hinder a child's ability to form healthy relationships as they grow older. These outcomes highlight the urgent need for early intervention and community support to break the cycle of neglect. Many cases of neglect stem from parents who are overwhelmed by financial, emotional, or social challenges. Providing resources and support can prevent neglect before it begins. Some key resources include parenting classes. Local organizations and community centers often offer free or low-cost classes to help parents develop skills and strategies for managing stress and caring for their children. Food banks and shelters. Access to basic necessities like food, clothing, and housing can alleviate some of the pressures that lead to neglect. Hotlines and support groups. National hotlines such as the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline 1-800-4A-CHILD provide confidential support and connect families with local resources. Therapeutic services, counseling for parents and children, can address underlying issues such as trauma or substance abuse that contribute to neglect. Encouraging parents to seek help without fear of judgment is crucial. Communities that foster a culture of support and understanding are better equipped to prevent neglect and protect children. Preventing child neglect requires a collective effort. Communities must remain vigilant and proactive in identifying and addressing potential cases of neglect. Early intervention is key. Research shows that children who receive timely support are more likely to recover from the effects of neglect and lead healthy, productive lives. Dr. Karen Fields, a child psychologist, emphasizes the role of community involvement. Neglect is not just a family issue, it's a societal issue. When neighbors, teachers, and community members step in, they can change the trajectory of a child's life. It's about creating a safety net that catches children before they fall too far. Skylar Gardner's story is a heartbreaking reminder of what can happen when warning signs are ignored. By recognizing the signs of neglect, taking action, and supporting struggling families, we can prevent similar tragedies and ensure that every child has the opportunity to grow up in a safe, nurturing environment. The responsibility lies with all of us. Skylar Gardner's tragic death is not just a story of individual neglect. It is a reflection of systemic failures that allowed her suffering to go unnoticed for months. Despite clear warning signs, no intervention came in time to save her. Neighbors heard cries, daycare staff noticed absences, and even acquaintances saw the deteriorating conditions, yet no one acted decisively. This tragedy highlights the gaps in child welfare systems where overburdened caseworkers and a lack of resources often leave vulnerable children at risk. The broader implications are clear. Communities and institutions must work together to create stronger safety nets for children. This includes better training for educators, healthcare workers, and law enforcement to recognize and report neglect, as well as increased funding for child protective services to ensure timely investigations. Skylar's story is a painful reminder that the responsibility to protect children extends beyond their immediate caregivers. It is a collective duty. Skylar's story is a call to action for all of us. It urges us to remain vigilant, to speak up when we see signs of neglect, and to advocate for systemic changes that prioritize the safety of children. Her life, though tragically short, can serve as a catalyst for change if we choose to act. Skylar's story reminds us that the most vulnerable among us depend on our vigilance. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Shadows of Crime for more investigations that shed light on these critical issues. What do you think could have been done to save Skylar? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As we remember Skylar, let us also remember the countless other children who suffer in silence. Their voices may be unheard, but their stories demand our attention. Together, we can honor their memory by ensuring no child is left behind.